Okay, so for our first question, our big concern is this 0.57 in the domain of cosine inverse? So let's actually make a list of each of our domains, right? So for cosine inverse, we're looking at -1 to 1, right? Well, 0.57 is definitely a part of that. So our solution here is just 0.57. You can include the 0 if you want. Okay. The domain of our next one with tangent, if you remember, tangent's domain is all real numbers. So we can essentially plug in whatever we want, and that includes 125. So again, you just get 125. And on both of these examples, we're allowed to do that because these two functions are inverses of each other, right? So this is inverse function composition. Next up, we've got sine, but I'm going to point out this is not sine inverse. It's just regular sine. So let me leave a space for sine inverse just so we have them in a nice, neat order. And then we're just going to do sine next to it. So the domain of sine is bracket -pi/2 to pi/2, okay? So does pi/3 live within that? Yes, it absolutely does, right? So because pi/3 belongs to this group, again, our result is just pi/3, right? If it did not, for this particular case, we would do that same process we did in the last, in the middle video on the last page, where we have to find a reference angle and kind of adjust to get back to the angle that we want. Okay, next up, we've got another tangent question. This time again, it's regular tangent. So here we're looking for our domain is tangent, and that goes from open parenthesis -pi/2 to pi/2. So again, does -pi/6 live within that? Yes, it does. Because that -pi/6 is in that group, our solution is just -pi/6. Is cosine inverse and cosine of 4 pi/3. Now again, we don't have cosine written down on this list. So the domain of cosine goes from 0 to pi. Remember, that's kind of the odd man out in that group, right? So because its domain goes from 0 to pi, that means that whatever we plug in here needs to be within that group, right? Well, unfortunately for us, 4 pi is larger than that. So this does not belong, 4 pi/3, excuse me, is larger than that interval. So we have to use another approach. So again, we're gonna emphasize this inner portion for just a minute, and we want to figure out what is cosine of 4 pi/3. So over off to the side somewhere, we've got cosine 4 pi/3. Well, that 4 pi/3 belongs to the third quadrant, right? So this angle here is 4 pi/3. We're going to spend some time looking at this reference angle, right? So if this is pi and that's 4 pi/3, we say 4 pi/3 minus pi, and I'm going to write it as 3 pi/3. So our reference angle is pi/3. Right? So we've got cosine 4 pi/3 is equal to, I'm going to leave a space for my plus or minus sign, cosine pi/3. Now we're in the third quadrant, so all students take calculus. Again, that's tangents territory, so this is negative. So if I want to know what cosine of pi/3 is, again, I use my left-hand rule. Pi/3 is this one, right? So for cosine, that means that your index finger is down, right? And we're just going to count how many you have above that index finger, and that's 1, right? So your cosine is 1, square root of 1 really, over 2, which translates to just a half. So you end up with -1/2. Okay, so now we want to figure out, now we want to find cosine inverse of that negative 1/2, right? So remember, cosine, I'm going to extend my left-hand rule here, only has two quadrants, quadrant 1 and quadrant 2, right? So if we were to figure out negative 1/2, it's really this same measurement. So it's that reference angle. So kind of the taller one up here. This is pi over 3, right? So this still gives us that 1/2, but because we're in the second quadrant, it's a negative 1/2 with whatever y is, right? I just translate it to that other quadrant. So this ends up giving us whatever pi minus pi over 3 is, that's 2 pi over 3. So final answer, 2 pi over 3. And again, notice cosine inverse is kind of the outermost function. It's the last thing we do. And our answer is an angle. That's not by coincidence. Those two things go together. How about number 6 down here? We've got sine inverse of sine pi. Again, I want to consider the domain. I can just write it again since it's all the way at the top. The domain we're looking at here, for sine is that negative pi over 2, pi over 2, right? That we're using. I'm just thinking about this inner portion, right? So this is definitely not within that. Pi goes beyond, right? So I can find a value for sine of pi. So our focus again is going to be first on the inner portion of this. So what is sine of pi? Well, that's one of your quadrantal angles, right? So again, if you imagine a unit circle, pi is going to be out here. Imagining I drew that straight. Pi is going to be out here. The ordered pair for that is going to be -1 and 0, right? So the y value, which lines up with sine, is 0. Okay, so then we're asking sine, let me write it in black. We're asking what is sine of that 0, right? This 0 goes in here. But again, I'm limited when I'm talking about sine inverse. We're asking what is sine inverse when we plug in that 0 that we just found, right? It's replacing that value. And we're doing this again because pi is larger than this domain over here. Okay, so sine of 0, if you remember, we're limited to quadrants 1 and 2 for sine. Here's quadrant 1, there's quadrant 2, there's quadrant 2. So we're pretty limited. And so the only place within this kind of rotation where sine is equal to 0, or the only angle measure that makes that happen, is here when theta is equal to 0. So this final answer is just 0. Okay. Last but not least, again, our emphasis here, I want to think about that domain since cosine inverse is on the inside of this, right? I need to think about the domain from -1 to 1, right? So does 3 pi belong to that -1 to 1? No, this is too big, right? But it's not, it's too big in the wrong place, if that makes any sense. So take a moment really fast and actually plug into your calculator cosine inverse of 3 pi. It doesn't work, right? Sure, you could reduce it down, maybe find a value, something that's coterminal, but the only thing that would really be coterminal to that would be pi and then negative pi, right? And so on in that direction. So there's really no way to reduce it down enough so that it fits within this interval. So this one actually we just say is undefined because there's no way to rewrite that, to adjust it, to whatever, so that we can get an actual answer out of it. All right?